If my memory serves me correctly, I was on the loop around the city of Indianapolis heading to an event like this when I got my first indication of trouble. As I said, I was on the road traveling to do some work with a church in that area, and as I'm traveling, I get a phone call from a young man that I know, and he said, do you have a minute? I need to talk to you. And so I did. A little background will be helpful here. About 6 months before this young man had been interning with a church, grooming himself to preach the gospel. And he had decided at that time that he was going to leave his internship early because he was interested in going to grad school. And at that time, it just was a good time in life, no kids, to get some more education. And so he had decided to go down that path. He'd gotten a job and moved and was going to school. And now 6 months had gone by, and he's calling. And so we talked. And he said, now look, don't freak out. And I hate it when people start like that, don't you? Because when someone tells me not to freak out, that is what, learn this, guys. That is immediately what I'm doing. I'm freaking out. He said, I want to talk to you about alcohol, but I don't want you to think I'm drinking. I'm not. I don't want to drink. I was just out with some guys last night, and we started talking about that, and they said some things, and I really know how to answer them. So I've got some questions. I want to talk to you about that for a minute. So we did for about a half an hour. He told me about his questions, and I tried to help him with those and went back and forth a little bit. And when we got done, it seemed like he was satisfied, and so we said our goodbyes and got off the phone. But I was not satisfied. Have you ever had one of those conversations that ended well, but there just was this creepy feeling in my gut that I did not get all of the story, that there was more to this. And there was, because there were more phone calls. And there were more questions. And the questions were growing more fundamental and more profound. So, one phone call, he was worried about imprecatory psalms. He didn't really understand how that worked. And so he wanted to talk about that. And then we were talking about whether or not you could really be sure that the Bible was the Word of God. And then we were talking about, could you even really be sure there was a God at all? In this astonishingly brief period of time, this young guy had gone from grooming himself to preach the gospel to being on the very edge of his faith, completely collapsing. It was astonishing and not unfamiliar, right? Because even as I'm sharing this story about my experience with this young man, you are probably thinking about some people you know who have had similar journeys, maybe people close to you. We have an epidemic of young people losing their faith among us. We talked about that on Friday night. I know a lot of these kids. The difference this time was, it wasn't just another random kid that I knew in some place who was losing his faith. It was my kid, my son, losing his faith. So over the last 5 years, I've relented to my wife's urging, and in my teaching, I've started sharing a little bit with folks about this difficult journey she and I are making with our oldest. And so just about everywhere I go and preach, I needle the elders to let me talk about this. So they will tell you they were needled here too, because I really wanted to go down this road. And as I've gone places and I've preached this remarkable thing has happened. It's like I don't preach anything else the rest of the week. I've literally had people lined up after services waiting for 30 or 40 minutes so they could take a moment to share their story and their grief. It has just been remarkable. And I'm picking up on some things that even after almost 4 decades of preaching, that I really haven't appreciated. Number one, there are a lot of people among us grieving their wayward children. Lots and lots. And two, as I began to process that, another terrible reality struck me. I began looking back on more than 3 decades of preaching and trying to remember some time in my sermons when I had spoken to these hurting people that I knew were in my church family. And I'm embarrassed to tell you, I couldn't think of a single time. They may have gotten some glancing attention, maybe as a side point while I was talking about something else in a lesson, but in terms of really directing any kind of focused teaching to help people going through this, I can honestly say I'd never done that. Not in 30 years. What was worse as I began to realize that, it occurred to me that all of the sermons I had preached about raising kids, and that is among my thickest files of lessons. I've preached lots and lots about raising kids. How surely those lessons must have been like pouring salt in the wound, don't you imagine? To parents whose kids were grown and were wayward, only adding to the sense, I must not have done the right things, I must be a failure. I guess to some degree that is unavoidable, but it just sure seems like it would have been nice along the way to have also offered some comfort and consolation and guidance and counsel. And so out of all of that, I began to realize this sermon I want to share with you was born. So I have 3 things in mind that I would like to do tonight. If I don't do anything except raise our level of sensitivity to this hurting crowd of people among us, then I think this will be time well spent. In fact, if I could just suggest in a broader sense, I think we need to think more about people among us that may quietly hurt and we don't realize. When I began to think about the prodigal parents I had neglected, the additional thought was, who else is there that we're not thinking about that's hurting and needs care and attention? So if I sensitize us, that's a good thing. Secondly, if you've got wayward kids, I'm hoping that this will offer some counsel and some guidance. I'm going to share with you in part some portions of a letter I received from a friend of mine in about our first year of dealing with our son. I'm telling you that now so that if you like what I say tonight, I'll be happy to take credit for it. If you don't, I'm happy to throw him under the bus too, okay? But I hope that if you're going through that, we'll say some things that will help you. And then thirdly, for everybody else that doesn't have wayward children, but just wants to fulfill Galatians 6:2 and help those who are struggling with the load to lift, I hope that we'll offer some things that will give you a sense of how you could do that. And so as we wrestle to process prodigal children, there are 4 things that I want to recommend about that tonight. This is actually sort of a connecting lesson because there is certainly a teaching component to what I'm trying to share with you tonight. It's a special group of kids we're trying to teach, and I do want to say some things about reaching them, but it will have connective tissue with tomorrow, where I really want to say some things to underscore how vital our work is with our kids in our church families. I want to lift up and exalt that work tomorrow by talking to you a little bit about what our kids are going through and what they're going to be facing in the future. So in some ways, this lesson kind of connects those 2 pieces. So 4 things as you try to wrestle with prodigal children that I would recommend to you. Number 1, I want to say that you're not alone, and I really want to emphasize that a lot. I think I have always recognized that when I get up to speak for a church family, that there are surely people there that have wayward kids. I'm sure even in this crowd right now, I'm talking to people who have wayward children. I think what I didn't realize is how big that crowd is. After all, it's not information that we want to share with everybody, is it? I mean, if your kid hits the winning home run to capture the state championship for us high school. We want a picture that's going on Facebook. We want 1,000 likes. I mean, we want everyone to know about that. But if he gets busted because he has marijuana in his locker, we don't want anybody to know about that. And you're certainly not going to be contacting whoever does a church bulletin and say, you know, I'm pretty sure my kid's losing his faith. I'd like you to put that in the bulletin next Sunday, right? In fact, I mentioned a minute ago that my wife has needled me about talking about this because for the first year, I didn't talk about it. I mean, to her, but that was it. We didn't talk to anybody in our church family about it. We didn't talk to our own family about it. It was me and her and our kid and what he was going through, and that was it. And it makes me wonder who else is in that situation. I preached on this at a church that I had worked with for 12 years. And one of the shepherds in this church I had worked with for 12 years came to me afterwards and asked me to pray for his wayward son. I didn't know he had a son, much less one that was prodigal. So I want you to get your minds around that who is it that may be suffering that we don't even know about? It's not a new problem. In fact, it's a problem as old as Adam and Eve, right? Who had a wayward son who was murderously rebellious. I think about Samuel. You know, Samuel appointed his son to serve as judges in his place, but those boys were wicked and corrupt and did all kinds of terrible things. You know, this devastated their father. There was King David in the Old Testament, who the Spirit says is a man after God's own heart, and yet the wicked behavior of his children just caused unspeakable grief on the back end of his life. I mean, it's all through the Bible story, and it continues to be true today. So I can tell you, if you're going through this, there are people all over the country that are right where you are. I've met them. Good people, grieving wayward children. And there are people in this place that are going through that. And the other really cool thing is there are people who don't have wayward children but deeply care about those who do and want to help bear the burden in keeping with the Spirit's instruction in Galatians 6 and 2. One of the things Heidi and I have really been encouraged about is that our brothers and sisters who know what we are going through, they're not judgy and critical and they don't say things like, well, you know, when y'all were bringing them up, we kind of, you know, they don't do anything like that. Our friends just love on us and they cry with us and they grieve with us and they want to support us and help us. And I think you'll find that too. So I want you to know you're not alone. And you don't have to keep the secret. It's a lot of people are going through this. It's okay to talk about it. Okay? So number one, you're not alone. Ready for this next one? I just gave that point first to warm you up because the next one, well, my wife sometimes says that I really have lessons that have 1 point and I just throw in the other stuff because the lesson's supposed to have 1 point or 3 points or whatever, right? So the next one, I'm going to get into this and you're going to think I'm never finishing tonight. It's long, but you'll know why when you see the point, and then the last two won't be so long. So we won't be here till midnight, I promise. I really got to get to bed. I'm tired. So the second one is, it's not your fault. And I know it sounds self-serving for a dad with a wayward child. So that was the first thing my friend wrote in his letter. He said, it's not your fault. And then in parentheses, he wrote, and whatever you said in your mind to disagree with me just now, it's still not your fault, right? It's the third rail. It's the blame game. And all of us with wayward kids wrestle with that sense of blame. This is my fault. There are assumptions underneath there. The assumption that if my kid at some point, any point in his life, stops walking with Jesus, that is a commentary on failed parenting. Somewhere back there, I didn't say the right thing, I didn't do the right thing, I had a bad moment, he saw that, somewhere back there, this is my fault. And there would be somebody who would hear me say that, they would say, well, of course that is true, because even the Bible teaches that, right? You know where I'm going in the Bible? Every parent with a prodigal knows Proverbs 22 and verse 6. So will you go there in your Bible? Proverbs 22 and verse 6. Where the text says, you've heard this, right? train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. So think about this. If you raise your children to serve the Lord, they will continue to serve the Lord, right? So work that backwards, the logic. If your children do not continue to serve the Lord, then it must be because you didn't train them up right. And over the years that I have grown up among God's people, that's how I've heard that verse explained, which is why so many parents with wayward kids just struggle with guilt. What did I do? So, obviously, I've spent some time working on this text, and I've learned some things that I didn't realize over all the years. So a couple of things I want to point out to you. First of all, you'll notice the text does not say, raise up your children to serve the Lord. Does any of your Bibles say that? What does it say? Train up your child in what? The way he should go. You know, I didn't realize until the last 5 or 6 years that there are actually some different ways people understand that language. And oddly enough, I even looked at the marginal reference in my Bible, and another way that could be rendered is according to his way. And so there are some people who believe that what the wise man is saying is this: raise your kid his way, in keeping with his talents and abilities. Or to say it another way, if your kid is more artsy than athletic, let him be in the band and don't make him play football if that's not his thing. Or if he's not good with numbers, don't push him to be an accountant because dad and mom are accountants. Let him go his way. And that is one, I think, possible way to understand the language of the verse here. By the way, either way, is that good advice? Because we've all seen parents push kids into things that were not their way, and that doesn't end well. So, first of all, we may not have understood the verse in the right way and what it's really talking about to start with. But let's assume for a moment that it is true that he's saying, raise your children up to serve the Lord. The second thing that's critical to processing this verse the right way is to understand that it is a proverb. And Proverbs do not speak of absolutes. Proverbs speaks of things that are generally so, not guarantees. And if you think that sounds a little sketchy coming out of the mouth of a father with a prodigal, I would just suggest that's how we interpret the other Proverbs too. I could demonstrate that to you. Go back a little bit to Proverbs chapter 10. Look at Proverbs 10 in verse 27. Proverbs 10, verse 27. The wise man says, the fear of the Lord prolongs life. The years of the wicked will be shortened. Now, I think that's generally true. If you fear the Lord and follow his path, it is probable that your life will be longer, at least in the sense you'll avoid doing some dumb stuff that'll cut your life short, right? But I got to tell you, folks, I know for a fact that's not absolutely true. I got a good friend that's hardly in his 40s right now who's going to die soon. He has ALS. He's a good man. And I didn't think Hugh Hefner was ever going to die. I used to use him as an example at this point in the sermon. Hugh Hefner's still alive. Finally, the old geezer died. But he lived a long, long time. And would anyone argue that he was an extraordinarily evil human being? It did a whole lot to corrupt our world. So is this passage wrong? No, we've just interpreted and used it wrong. It's a proverb, generally true, not a guarantee. One more example of that, Proverbs 15:1. I just give you this one because this is one of my favorite verses in Proverbs because it works so much. Proverbs 15:1, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. I promise you that that's true a lot of the time. When I get into heated conversations, my rule is low and slow. So drop your volume, slow down your pacing. at some point it just becomes necessary for them to be quiet because they can't hear me anymore because I just start kind of talking like this, low and slow, right? And sometimes that will actually drain the energy out of conversation, calm people down. This works. Most of the time. I have talked low and slow to somebody who was mad, and they just got madder and madder and madder, used the moment to run all over me verbally. It doesn't work all the time. It's not intended to. That's not the nature of Proverbs. Does that make sense? Do you buy that? See where we're going? So now go back to 22:6. Could we just do with 22:6 what we do with all the other Proverbs? Train up your child in the way that he should go. When he is old, he will not depart from it. If you raise your kids to serve the Lord, is that generally how things will work out? I think it is. You teach your kids to love and serve Jesus, and that's probably what they will do. Is it a guarantee? Oh, those of you who are raising kids, let me freak you out. There are no guarantees, right? We need to be careful with the way we've handled God's word, because this passage has been wrongly used to torment parents who have enough grief and sorrow and don't need more added on to it. Now, I do know that just correcting our misunderstanding of Proverbs 22:6 probably doesn't alleviate the guilt, because I still think that if we have wayward kids, we still believe in our heart, yes, but somewhere back there, I must have done something wrong. And so let me add something additional that I hope will help us by the point that's on the slide. And that is that I think one of the reasons we do that is we try to simplify what isn't simple at all. We try to simplify something that is very complicated. So if you spend some time working on why young people are losing their faith today, it will help you. Because the truth is that there are lots and lots and lots of things that contribute to the destabilizing of people's faith. How long do I want to stay tonight? Because we could do this for a while. Let me mention a couple things to you and thoroughly muddy the waters on this issue. First of all, I think parents do make a difference, and I think Proverbs tells us that. So go back to Proverbs. Look this time at Proverbs 29. I'm looking at Proverbs 29 and verse 15. Think about this. Proverbs 29, verse 15, the rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child who gets his own way brings shame to his mother. Now, do you not see a linkage there between parental failure and kids who grow up to be troubled adults? Do you see the linkage there? There's a kid that doesn't ever get punished for misbehaving. And you know how that's going to work out when he becomes an adult. Somebody's going to teach him that crime doesn't pay. And if it's not mom and dad, it's going to be a boss or a judge or somebody like that, right? But he's going to learn that lesson. So parental failure can contribute to a kid's trouble as an adult. So you don't hear me denying that tonight, right? Parents absolutely matter. I want you to hear me say that. That's important. And yet none of us are going to do this perfectly, right? That's this really interesting thing God does. He gives children to people who have no experience raising children. And I promise you, you got to be a grandpa to know that. Grandpas know that better than you. Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? Yes. In a sense, we all kind of grow up together. And we stumble and make mistakes together. That's the hard thing about having a prodigal, because that's what we want to know. Well, what was it? Where did I mess up that caused my kid to have this spiritual collapse? But let me just mess up that thinking in your mind. Do you realize that these families, all their children are serving God? You realize they messed up too? In fact, in some cases, they had the same blunders that you did. Sometimes they overemphasized things that weren't that important. Sometimes they had bad moments of failure where maybe dad lost his cool and behaved badly and set a bad example for his kids. Yeah, those perfect families had moments like that too. So how did it work out that way? In fact, have you ever noticed, let me add this thirdly, that parenting and outcome don't always line up? I know it sounds self-serving, I know, but a lot of what I'm saying sounds self-serving. Yet you know it's true too, right? Because you have, yeah, thank you, because everybody's wondering about the weed eater. For the folks online, there's weed eater noise outside. So you've seen the family that had 3 or 4 little kids growing up, And mom and dad looked like, from what we could tell on the outside, they were doing all the right things. And those kids were just angels. And they grew up into angelic adults, right? Except one, right? They had the one rebel in the family that from the time he got any freedom, he was defying mom and dad and doing his own thing, right? How did that happen? And what's more bizarre is when that happens in reverse. And I've seen that too. I've seen families that had kids growing up, and I don't mean to be judgy, folks, but I know what God's word said, and they weren't doing that stuff. And it turned out just like you would expect with their children, most of them, except this one. I knew this kid who grew up in a rotten home, and he was just the most godly young man, devoted to the Lord. Would you please explain that to me? How does that happen? It's a biblical problem. I think about one of my favorite characters, King Josiah. King Josiah, you know, that kid who comes to the throne and is this great leader. We'll talk about him tomorrow morning, so I won't belabor that point. But go back and look at his family history, folks. It isn't pretty. His family really stank. They were terrible. How did he come from that family? I have a son that preaches the gospel. And a son who's not sure there is a God. And my wife and I scratch our heads and think, how did they both grow up in our house? How does that happen? The fourth thing I would add to thoroughly mix the waters here is that we will not be the only people that influence our children. Even if you homeschool, you are not going to be the only people that influence your children. So back in Proverbs 1, the wise man warns us about that. Proverbs 1 in verse 8. Hear, my son, your father's instruction. Do not forsake your mother's teaching. Indeed, they are a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. So notice in verses 8 and 9, even when parents have done the job and given the children what they need, and the Spirit here is telling them to listen to the good teaching of your mom and dad, he still warns in verse 10. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. And he goes on to talk about the danger of another voice out there. Kids at school, kids in the neighborhood, kids at some organization they're in, a future spouse being an adverse influence, an evil voice, and pulling them away from Jesus. They're going to hear another voice. And it isn't just the other voice. Sometimes it's just stuff in life. I've talked to people who've been through a season when they lost their faith. I had a lady sharing with me one time, she was really close to one of her teachers at school, and he died unexpectedly and suddenly. And she said, you know, I thought God would understand how much I needed this person, and then he took him away from me. That was her perception of it. And she said, I just didn't get it. And for a while, she was away from the Lord. It might be the death of someone close, maybe a divorce or an unfaithful spouse. All kinds of things can happen during the journey that can shake our faith and threaten our spiritual foundation. And all of us have to decide as we make the journey how we are going to respond to the obstacles that come up along the way. All of us have to decide how we're going to respond. You see it? So when my friend wrote to me and he said, it's not your fault. I don't think he was saying anything about my parenting, good or bad. I don't think he was trying to say, no, David, you really were a good parent. I think he was trying to say, it's not about your parenting. In fact, it was interesting. As he was commenting about that, he wrote, you know, when he was doing good, you took too much credit. And now that he's doing bad, you're taking too much blame. Because at the end of the day, hear me on this. Everybody will make their own choice about God. Everybody makes their own choice about God. I do not get to go before God on Judgment Day and say, look, I would have served you, but I had a crowd of friends at school who drugged me away from you. Or I had some bad things happen to me. Or I married this evil woman who pulled me away. Purely hypothetical. My wife's wonderful. Just want to be sure we're clear on that. You know I don't get to do that, right? Because everyone makes their own choice about God. Why was Josiah, who came from such a rotten family, why was he devoted to the Lord? Because he chose the Lord, brothers and sisters. We all make our own choice about God. Now, I know when I say that, I really haven't thoroughly covered this, because there are still people who say, yes, but I know I failed my kids. I know some people who weren't Christians when their kids were growing up. They obeyed the gospel late in life, never taught their kids anything about the Lord. And some who were just in a bad place spiritually when their kids were growing up. Maybe they sort of were hanging on the fringes of the church and didn't get serious about the Lord until maybe mom and dad died, and by then their kids were grown, and they look back and they know. What if you're in that position and you look back and you know, I have failures as a parent? Fine, then own it and apologize. Write a letter to your kid and say, I should have done better. I wish I had known the Lord. I wish I'd been more devoted to the Lord. I let you down in that regard. I apologize. Please forgive me. And then remember, we can help lay a spiritual foundation, and we can sort of take our kids and orient them in the right direction, get them headed down that right path. And at the end of the day, that's all that we can do. At the end of the day, your kid will decide about God. So will mine. I know that I cannot go before God in Judgment Day and say, I am not serving you because my parents didn't pray with me enough when I was growing up and didn't have enough home Bible studies with me. I know that I can't do that. But if I don't get to do that, neither does my kid, right? Now, a moment of transparency. I understand that up here. I understand the logic. I understand the scripture. I get that up here. Intellectually, I have that figured out. I'm working on it down here. And maybe we do for the rest of our lives. Okay? Just know that these are different. Okay? This is what is true. This is how we feel. And we're going to struggle to get those lined up. It's not your fault. All right, that's where I wanted to dwell. 2 more that won't be as long, I promise. Number 3, never give up. I was also in the letter my friend wrote to me, and I have to confess that it offended me. I thought, why would you say that to me? Do you not know me at all? This is my child. I'm not going to give up on him. I'm going to fight for his soul the rest of my life. But the letter came early in the journey, the first year. This is the 7th year. And we have covered a lot of ground. And some of it's been really, really hard. And I'm embarrassed to tell you, but my wife is sitting here, so she knows. I've had the moment where I've just said, I give up. I can't get through this kid. He's not listening. We're not getting anywhere. I'm wasting my time. I give up. And every time I do that, I think about the letter and thought, I was wrong about that. I needed to hear it. I need to be reminded. So I'm saying to you, if you've got a wayward kid, don't give up. Now, I can't leave that alone because I'm so worried someone will hear that and they'll misunderstand my point. So let's unpack it just a bit tonight. Not a lot, but just a little bit. When I say don't give up, I do not mean constantly press this issue with your child. Constantly raise it and fuss at them about the fact that they're not serving God. I am not suggesting that at all. In fact, what I am going to suggest is listen to the counsel of Paul in Colossians 4. This text has been more helpful to me than any other in processing my wayward son. Colossians chapter 4, it's a lesson, or a text rather, that helps us in our relationships with unbelievers. What I had forgotten along the way is that's where my son is. He's a lost person. And so I need to deal with him like I deal with lost people, which is what I do all the time. So I'm going to pick up at verse 2 of Colossians 4, where the wise man says, devote yourself to prayer, keeping alert in it with an attitude of thanksgiving. praying at the same time for us as well, that God will open up to us a door for the word so that we may speak forth the mystery of Christ for which I have been imprisoned, that I may make it clear in the way that I ought to speak. Conduct yourself with wisdom toward outsiders, making the most of opportunity. Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. So if I had to cast an umbrella over all of that and summarize it, I think the Spirit's admonition to us is that when you are dealing with eternal matters, with lost people, be wise. And then he unpacks it for us and tells us what he has in mind. Take every opportunity and get the most out of it. And to do that, you really need to think about what you say. Let your words be gracious and fitting and appropriate for the need of the moment. And if all that is true, can I just tag on to the end of that this thought, that sometimes that means knowing when it would be wise not to say anything? I know if you've got a wayward child, what you just heard me say is cut off your right arm. I feel that way too. I mean, that is really hard. But I do understand that with lost people. Some people that I deal with who are lost are closed. I kind of try to plant a seed and they're like, not interested. What happens if you keep pressing and the door is closed? I think some people get hardened to us and they don't want to talk to us anymore, and it might actually harm future opportunities. When they're not open, I don't keep pushing. And so I had to realize that sometimes my son isn't open, and I can't keep pushing. And so I need to stop trying to say something. I remember one Sunday afternoon, he was still sort of going to church at that time, and I had been, let me pick my word, I'd been encouraging him about coming to worship. And he had some stuff stored in our attic, and it was hot, and he was getting stuff out of the attic, so he was a mess, sweaty, and yeah. And I'm looking at my watch. It's 4:15, and we start at 5. 45 minutes, and he's standing in my garage with boxes, needing a shower. And so I wanted to say, okay, enough. 45 minutes, bud. Chop, chop. Need to get to church. Been telling you that. And in a rare moment of wisdom, I thought to myself, he knows that. You don't need to say it again. And so with every ounce of self-discipline that exists in my body, I bit my tongue and kept my mouth shut. I didn't need to say it. It would not have been helpful at that moment. So sometimes we need to know when to just not say anything. Now, when I say sometimes we keep our mouth shut, it doesn't mean we don't do anything, because you'll notice in the passage that I just read for you that there's all kinds of other stuff going on here. Notice in verse 3, for example, he puts this great emphasis on devotion to prayer, and notice particularly praying that God will open up to us a door for the word. I would suggest if you're dealing with a prodigal that is closed, be careful that you're not running ahead of God. If he's closed, then the first thing I need to do is I need to bring that to God and ask God to open the door and let God do his thing first. What better way to reach our children than to do it in partnership with Jehovah? And so I need to be quiet and be on my knees and be praying for God to open the door. And then when he talks in verse 5 about making the most of the opportunity and letting our speech be with grace, to me that implies some work on our part with my son. I try to think about some of the spiritual struggles that he's going through, some of the questions that he's had. I've read books. I have to tell you, if nothing else comes out of this whole Prodigal journey with him, it has strengthened my faith, because I've done more to confirm my belief in God and the Bible is the Word of God than I've ever done in my life. It's been really helpful to me. as I prepare myself to talk to him. And so when I say don't say anything, I'm not saying don't do anything. So there are all kinds of things I can do to prepare myself and get the Lord working with me. So when the opportunities come, I'm ready to have a meaningful exchange with him. I keep a journal. And in the back of my journal, I have a list of 150 kids that somebody's grieving. I don't even know some of them. People hand me slips of paper with their name on it. And I write them in my book. And I have about 15 things that I ask God for these kids. And I'll be glad to take a scrap of paper from you with a name on it and add it to my book. And we'll ask God to help us. And until he comes, and while I'm still here, we're not going to give up. We're going to keep trying. Last, don't give up, but you've got to keep going. We have to continue the journey. That's hard for me to say. This is the hardest point for me because Heidi and I always imagined that we would make the journey with our children. From the time they were born. I remember being in the hospital and looking at this new little baby. And we had a lot of desires for our kids, what we hoped their life would be like, but we agreed from the beginning, before we even had kids, that what mattered to us is that our kids grow up and serve the Lord. And that was the focus of our life, to raise our sons to love and serve the Lord. But then they became independent adults. I mean, like it's real independent adults, like we weren't even paying their insurance or their cell phone, right? They were on their own. And discovered that there comes a point where they decide. And sometimes when people decide, they make another choice. And if not with your children, I promise you along the way, you're going to experience that with somebody that you love and care about. If not your kids, maybe your mom or dad. Or maybe a brother or sister, or someone else in your extended family. Surely, if you're in a church family any length of time, someone in your spiritual family is going to make that awful choice to stop and to leave the path. And so when that happens, we know what happens. A rescue mission breaks out. And we do everything we can to appeal to this person and change their minds. And sometimes that works. Don't ever give up trying to reach those people. I've had people come up to me and say, look, don't give up on your son. I was gone 15 years and I came back. And I'm thinking, that did not help me because I want this to be done in 15 minutes. 15 years? That means we're not half done. I don't know if I could do that, right? But they came back. One girl told me she was gone for a decade, and one of the ladies in her church would write her a note every week and not fuss at her. Just say, I missed you yesterday. Just wanted you to know I was thinking about you. Or, it's your birthday, happy birthday. Wrote her a note every single week for years and years and years. And she said, when the time came, I knew where to come back home. So, sometimes we work and we reach out, and they return. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes they never come back. My son may never come back to the Lord. So what then? What do we do when they have fallen off? And I don't get any indication that they're coming back. Here's what happens. You pick yourself up and you keep going. Do you hear me? We pick ourselves up and we keep going because, brothers and sisters, the devil would like nothing more than to make me and you the collateral damage of somebody else's spiritual catastrophe. It is one of his great evil. He uses the fall of others, not just to bring them down, but to bring down more. And so you have to decide. It doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter if it's one of my beloved brothers and sisters in this congregation. I've had some family members I really loved and care about that quit. Never came back. Or someone in your family, your brother or sister, your mom or dad, your children, your spouse. I got to tell you, brothers and sisters, I don't care who else doesn't keep going. Even if it's this lady down here that I love more than anyone else on the face of the earth. Even if she stops, I'm not. Because there's nothing more important in the end than being found in Jesus. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to keep going, no matter what happens to anybody else. That relationship I have with him is higher and greater than every other one. And I want to be with him in the end. You might think it odd that I didn't even read from Luke 15 tonight. Can I turn your thought there for just a moment as we wrap this up? I do want you to think about Luke 15. But I don't want you to think about that wayward child in Luke 15, who, by the way, really isn't the point of the story there. It's that ornery older brother that was the real problem Jesus was focused on. But I do want you to think about the dad. When people share with me their comeback stories, I really do enjoy hearing those. It makes me long for that day. I really hope I'll get to see my son come back home. But when I think about that reunion, I know a little bit about how God feels about me and you when we're away from him. And how he loves me more than I love my son. His love is greater than all of our love. And how he must feel when I am away from him. And how there must be this longing for us to come back home. And so I just, I can't but wonder if the crowd tonight, there's someone that's in that place, that you right now are a tender place on the heart of God. That he misses you. And it grieves him that you're away from him. And he wants so much for you to come back home. I understand that a little bit. I know what it's like to want a son to come back home. And maybe you've thought, yeah, but I've been in some bad places, and I am quite sure that God gave up on me a long time ago. You're just wrong about that. He never gave up on you. He's watching the road with tear-stained eyes, hoping maybe the day will be the day that you appear on the horizon. You come back home. Don't let tonight be a night that you break his heart again. If you need to get things squared away with him, we are here tonight so we can help you to do that. There's nothing more important than that. So we're going to sing this song and encourage you to make your way down to the front. Let's stand. Let's sing.
How deep